Welcome to the Piracy Iceberg. Today we'll cover topics all about the high seas, ranging from well-known entries like Blackbeard to the Frenchman that ate his victims alive. Get comfy and explore the Piracy Iceberg with me. So before we get into each entry, I'm gonna give you a brief overview of some piracy terms, so these terms will make a lot more sense later on. This also includes two entries at the top of the iceberg, so I'm gonna lump these together now. When people talk about pirates, you would often hear the words pirate, privateer, corsair, and buccaneer used more or less interchangeably, but this is wrong. And there is a difference. A pirate is a very broad term. It just refers to any misbehavior or crime happening at sea. This includes coastal raids, intercepting ships, murder, plundering treasure, everything illegal happening at sea and on a boat. You're a pirate. A privateer was a pirate with papers. They were private individuals, essentially mercenaries, hired by governments to rob merchant ships, pillaging settlements and taking over ships belonging to a rival country with their own armed ships. As you can tell, there might be confusion here since some privateers could be piratical, sometimes attacking ships that weren't targeted, or sometimes actual pirates could be hired by governments without them being legally considered privateers. So the line between a pirateer and a pirate is often very blurry. A corsair was a term specific to the Mediterranean, referring mostly to Muslim pirates aligned with the Ottoman Empire between the 14th to 19th century. They were privateers, but corsairs specifically refer to these Ottoman-sponsored privateers aiming to disrupt the Christian states of Europe maritime commerce. In some contexts, corsair can also mean a privateer or a pirate working under the French crown. Finally, a buccaneer is a term specifically referring to the Caribbean and Pacific coasts. The word buccaneer derives from boucanier, French settlers who hunted and smoked lots of wild animals in the Caribbean. They smoked these animals over something called a boucan, essentially a wooden frame, hence boucanier. Buccaneer. They were hunters before turning to piracy and mainly raided Spanish merchant ships leaving for Europe. Or in other words, a pirate does naughty stuff at sea. A privateer is a hired person who does naughty stuff at sea. A corsair is mostly an Ottoman who does naughty stuff at sea, and a buccaneer is most commonly a Frenchman who does naughty stuff at sea in the Caribbean. This should give you an idea of the different terms. With that out of the way, let's finally dive in. Blackbeard. Edward Teach or Thatch, or more widely known as Blackbeard, was one of history's most infamous pirates, if not the stereotypical pirate in media today. Little is known about his early life, but he was probably born in Bristol, England in 1680 and very likely went by a pseudonym. We're gonna see this more often in the iceberg, but pirates loved using pseudonyms as to not tarnish their family name or to keep themselves hidden from authorities, so it is likely Edward Teach was a pseudonym and his real name will probably never be known. In 1716, he joined the crew of Captain Benjamin Hornigold, who became a renowned pirate during this time. Remember him, he becomes important in later entries as well. Hornigold gifted Teach a sloop and set out for the American East Coast, where he was first mentioned as commanding a crew of around 70 men. Teach's crew grew to a flotilla of 3 ships, and in November 1717, his crew took over a French slave ship named La Concorde and captured it after a short battle. They probably recruited some of these slaves on board and left the rest on a small island in the Caribbean. He renamed La Concorde to Queen Anne's Revenge, and this would become his flagship in the following months. The ship had around 40 large guns and became notorious for ransacking and plundering multiple ships in the Caribbean. He and his crew held another crew captive and then sunk a sloop off the coast of Crab Island, where the captain described Teach as, quote, a tall spare man with a very black beard, which he wore very long. This was the first account of Teach's appearance. Later descriptions of Teach likely embellished this key detail of his, as the scholar Charles Johnson writes in his General History of the Pirates, sometimes the only source we have on renowned pirates, and we're gonna meet this guy a few times throughout the iceberg. So our hero, Captain Teach, assumed the cognomen of Blackbeard from that large quantity of hair, like a frightful meteor, covered his whole face and frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there a long time. His beard was black, which he suffered to grow of an extravagant length. As to breadth, it came up to his eyes. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbons and small tails and then turn them about his ears. He is also said to have strapped 3 pairs of pistols around his chest along with cutlasses and knives around his waist, though there are no reports of him actually murdering those he held captive. He likely kept his appearance as to strike fear into his opponents, and hoping they would just surrender to him instead of putting up a fight, which is a much more lucrative outcome for a pirate. By early 1718, Teach was at the height of his power, and in May, he and his group located the port of Charleston, South Carolina, ransacking any ships that would leave port. Over the next 5 or 6 days, 9 ships were plundered of their goods, and in one instance, he held a crew captive and ordered a ransom of expensive medicine, probably drugs, otherwise executing the crew if the requirements were not met. The government supplied the drugs, and the crew was let go. In June 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge and another ship ran aground a sandbar in North Carolina and were damaged beyond repair, thus Teach had to abandon his flagship. Later that year, Alexander Spotswood, Governor of Virginia, ordered a bounty on Teach's head, wanting him dead or alive. Royal Navy First Lieutenant Robert Maynard, on board the HMS Pearl, located Teach on Ocracoke Island. A bloody battle commenced, with Teach and Maynard fighting in hand-to-hand combat with their cutlasses, with Teach dying with 20 cutlass and 5 pistol wounds. Teach's head was promptly hung from the bowsprit, the very tip of the ship, of the sloop Jane. Many legends were spread after his death, partly due to embellishments like Charles Johnson earlier. It is said his skull was lined in silver and used as a cup, or he buried his treasure after his death. These legends will likely stay legends, and many believe this treasure never existed in the first place. However, in the 1990s, Queen Anne's Revenge was found off the coast of North Carolina, with many artifacts being recovered, including navigational devices, cannons, and a sword hilt. Blackbeard is probably the most famous pirate in existence and has spurred a ton of media over the centuries. Rightly so, he's a legendary figure in pirate history. Davy Jones. Davy Jones is one of many nautical superstitions and is a personification of the spirit of the sea, usually malevolent. A phrase you often hear is Davy Jones's locker, being a metaphor for the oceanic abyss, the resting place one would be sent to after drowning or sinking along with a ship. The true origin of this phrase is not known, but there is a dozen or so proposed origins, too many to mention here shortly, but many have attributed this to the biblical figure of Jonah or local folklore, though the first printed mention was in 1726 in the 4 years' voyages of Captain George Roberts. Quote, "But now they had no goods at all, he believed, having disposed of them all, either by giving them to other prizes or heaving the rest into Davy Jones's locker, i.e. the sea." So no one truly knows where this phrase came from, but it has influenced a lot of media over the centuries, like in the Pirates of the Caribbean film series. Somali pirates. Some may think piracy is a thing of the past, but piracy is still a very real thing to this day. As long as there is a ship and a crew, there's bound to be piracy involved. Somalian pirates are widely considered the most notable example of modern piracy, beginning in the early 90s, after the fall of the Somalian government, plunging the region into a brutal civil war which is sadly still ongoing, with the federal government being rendered essentially useless and the navy disbanding in 1990. Foreign fishing trawlers entered Somalian waters and began illegally dumping waste and overfishing the area. Local fishermen tried to defend themselves and began to band together and arm themselves, employing tactics like taking over foreign ships until the owner paid a ransom. It is important to note that Somalia lies in a critical geographic region, the Gulf of Aden, where more than 20% of global trade flows through. So you can probably see why this would be profitable for the locals, especially considering Somalia is a mostly agricultural country and the economy has been basically destroyed due to the civil war. In 2005, a tanker, MV Feisty Gas, and yes, that is its real name, was hijacked and ransomed for $315,000. I just had to include that. In 2010, the estimated costs due to piracy rose to $238 million. A year later, a report suggested that the indirect costs of piracy, which includes insurance, naval support, legal proceedings, rerouting of slower ships, and other costs, was estimated to be around $6.6 to $6.9 billion. Piracy reached its peak between 2008 and 2011, but a lot of anti-piracy measures have been taken over the years and has been steadily declining since 2012, although piracy activity has been getting a rebound since 2024. Out of the 4,185 soldiers whose ships were attacked by the pirates and 1,090 hostages in 2010, a third were sadly abused, many of them being used as human shields for pirate attacks or tortured. 62 people have died in a 4-year period, many due to suicide, malnutrition, and 25 due to murder, though it is important to mention the vast majority of pirates never hurt any captives and simply demand ransom. While pirate activity has waned over the years, some occasional incidents still occur. In the end, Somali piracy was less about glory, but more about survival and desperation, spawned from the unstable and lawless situation the locals lived in for years. Jolly Roger. The Jolly Roger refers to probably the most iconic symbol of piracy, that being a skull and crossbones on a black background. The origin of the name Jolly Roger is kind of unsolved. The name Roger does not refer to the actual name Roger, but likely was a euphemism for the devil, or sometimes called Old Roger. The term could also have derived from French Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, referring to the blood-red flags pirates used to fly, signaling no quarter. No quarter meant the ship's cargo, or valuables, would be taken by force and no mercy for life would be spared in the attack. Pirates would first fly a friendly flag or an allied nation's flag, giving their target a false sense of security, before hoisting the black flag, signaling quarter given, ordering the ship to surrender, and the crew's lives would be spared. If they did not heed this warning, they would hoist the red flag. To signal yes, the victim ship would have to take their own flag down, known as striking their flag. There are some variations to the Jolly Roger. Some had a skeleton, or a dagger, and a heart, which largely depended on the specific pirate crew. In any case, the Jolly Roger has become the defining symbol of piracy, even being the symbol of online piracy. Golden Age of Piracy. The Golden Age of Piracy spanned for around 80 years between 1650 and 1730, when piracy reached its peak across the Atlantic, Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and the coasts of Africa. Historians usually divide the period into three sub-eras: the buccaneering era, lasting from 1650 to 1680, characterized by French and English pirates in Tortuga, Martinique, and Jamaica, plundering Spanish merchant ships in the Caribbean and parts of the Pacific; the pirate round, lasting from the 1690s to early 1710s, when pirates traveled long distances to rob the British East India Company in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea; and finally the post-Spanish succession period, lasting from 1715 to 1726, sometimes early 1730s. This is the period most people refer to when talking about pirates, characterized by thousands of privateers left unemployed after the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, who then turned to piracy in the Caribbean, Indian Ocean, West Africa, and the east coast of America. It is far too hard to condense 80 years of history in a single entry, but in short, the period saw trade routes booming, colonies expanding, and thereby maritime travel and piracy expanding as well. Sea Peoples. If you're on this side of YouTube, you probably heard about this group of people. The Sea Peoples were a collection of tribes hypothesized to have attacked the eastern Mediterranean and especially Egypt around 1200 BCE during the Late Bronze Age collapse. The Late Bronze Age collapse is a huge can of worms in itself, but can be boiled down to a huge societal collapse where most states lasting centuries somewhat suddenly and violently disintegrated, notably the Hittites and the Greeks, who entered the Greek Dark Ages for around 4 centuries afterwards. The only states that continued to exist afterward were the Egyptians and the Assyrians in Mesopotamia. They're both much weaker than previously. Now that's cool and all, but what does that have to do with pirates? Well, Egyptian hieroglyphs, especially those of Pharaoh Ramses III or Meneptah, show Egyptians fighting against large armies of seaborne raiders, arriving via large flotillas from foreign lands. These sea peoples appear pretty abruptly in ancient history, as they are not mentioned after Ramses III's reign. Not much is known about these sea peoples, though many speculate they might have been an ancient form of pirates. They might have been a broad coalition of migrants who sought new lands, as they likely have suffered from the same societal decline. The Sea Peoples were probably comprised of tribes living around the Mediterranean, like the Shurden, Washesh, Lucca, Karkia, the Peliset, later becoming the Philistines, who settled in Canaan and became the main rivals of the Israelites, as seen in the Old Testament, and the Denyen. Some scholars believe the Denyen can be attributed to the tribe of Dan of the 12 tribes of Israel, as they are believed to be a seafaring people, as said in the Song of Deborah. In any case, these groups of people likely were skilled seafarers and could be considered the earliest form of pirates we know of. Oak Island. Oak Island is a small forested island off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, famous for being the site of one of the longest running treasure hunts in history. No one's really sure where the original myth comes from, but it is likely spread via word of mouth before being first published in print in 1863. A dying sailor from Captain Kidd's crew buried 2 million British pounds on Oak Island. We'll discuss Captain Kidd in detail later on as well. In 1795, Daniel McGuinness discovered a strange circular depression in the ground beneath as he was looking for a suitable location for his farm. Since he had heard of the story, he and his friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, kept digging and reportedly found a layer of flagstones, and then every 10 feet, or 3 meters, they found oak logs as markers. The ground was noticeably more loose than the surrounding soil, and the men found tool marks or pick scrapes along the walls of the shaft, known as the money pit. They gave up after digging 30 feet or 9.1 meters down. In 1802, the Onslow Company continued excavation in the pit, digging it to around 90 feet or 27 meters deep, and found layers of charcoal, putty, coconut fiber, and a mysterious stone slab inscribed with symbols. This stone slab remained unciphered and changed hands over the years. A local inn landlord commented, "Men who don't believe in Kidd's treasure say that it isn't an inscription at all. It's only some accidental scratches." One researcher claims the symbols read 40 feet below, 2 million pounds lie buried. You should take this translation with a huge grain of salt though, since the researcher says he got this information from a quote-unquote school teacher long since dead. In any case, they continued digging, but struck some sort of water tunnel, flooding the entire pit. To drain the water, the Truro Company decided to dig another tunnel, 109 feet or 33 meters deep, northwest of the original shaft, but this new shaft too was flooded, and the company thought an underwater tunnel was connected to the sea, as the water level sank and rose with the tides. In a nearby cove, they found the water tunnel system and dug a final tunnel in an effort to shut off this water system, but they failed once again, as this tunnel was filled with water as well, along with the money pit falling in on itself. It is speculated the treasure, if it even exists, fell through the third tunnel into a deep void, never to be seen again. There are far too many excavations done over the centuries to fully cover each and every one of them, so I'll cut it short here. Essentially, the treasure has not been found to this day, and it is very unlikely it ever will. But is this story true? Maybe. There may be other explanations for this weirdly shaped pit. Some scholars have proposed a sinkhole might have formed there. The ground would naturally be softer there, and the pit filled up with natural debris, like trees falling and blown into the pit, which would explain the oak logs. Another theory proposes the pit might have been a Masonic initiation rite, involving a hidden vault. Stephen Sora speculated the pit was dug by the Knights Templar and hides the Ark of the Covenant, or the Holy Grail. A strange place to hide it in my opinion though. Yet another theory purports that Francis Bacon is the actual author of the Shakespearean works, and Bacon made Oak Island for him and his followers a hiding spot to hide ancient manuscripts and important texts. Scholars claim to have found hidden symbolism alluding to the secret treasure in Shakespeare's texts on rock formations on Oak Island itself, and claims that the stone slab found in the pit contained a cipher Bacon allegedly used. According to marine biologist Barry Fell, the symbol on the stone resembled the Coptic alphabet, an ancient language spoken in Egypt. It allegedly translates to, quote, "To escape contagion of plague and winter hardships, he is to pray for an end or mitigation thereof. The people will perish in misery if they forget the Lord, alas." As you can tell, there are dozens of explanations, theories, and things alike about Oak Island, and I am barely scratching the surface. Let me know if you want a full-on deep dive on Oak Island in the comments below. Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny, or Anne Bonn in some sources, was one of a few recorded instances of a female pirate. Yes, surprisingly, piracy was not exclusively a male activity. In all of recorded history, only about 100 women went on to be pirates at sea, though many, including Anne Bonny, had to disguise as men, so the actual number may be much higher. There's basically no information about her early life, no primary sources, no records of baptisms, nothing. The only source we have on her early life is from the aforementioned scholar Charles Charles Johnson, which should be taken with a grain of salt, since this information may be embellished or plain wrong. We don't know when she was born, but her birth might date to around the year 1700 near Cork, Ireland. Early on, she and her parents moved to the province of Carolina in America. Her father, perhaps William Cormac, who was originally an attorney, was quite successful as a merchant and allegedly bought a plantation, though there are no records of this. Her mother died when she was grown up, and Anne Bonny married a poor sailor, which outraged her father, who then kicked her out. Anne Bonny and this sailor, whose existence is more than dubious, moved to Nassau on New Providence Island. In August 1720, Bonny, Johnny Rackham, and another woman, Mary Read, along with 13 other male pirates, stole a privateer sloop and put it out to sea, attacking merchant ships in the West Indies for 61 days. On these raids, Bonny handed out gunpowder to the men manning the guns, known as being a powder monkey. On September 5, 1720, the governor of New Providence, Woodes Rogers, put out a proclamation demanding the arrest of the crew, specifically naming Anne Bonny and Mary Read, though under their pseudonyms. A victim of the pirates, Dorothy Thomas of Jamaica, described Bonny and Read as follows, quote, "They wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and each one of them had a machete and pistol in their hand, and they cursed and swore at the men to murder her." On the 22nd of October 1720, Rackham and his crew were discovered by Jonathan Barnett, a former privateer, who attacked the resisting crew, but the crew quickly surrendered. They were taken to Jamaica, where they were tried for piracy. Rackham was tried first and found guilty, executed on November 18. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were tried on November 28 and also were found guilty after a short but inevitable trial, sentenced to hanging. Both Annie and Read asked for mercy because they were pregnant, which was likely granted by the jury, although it is unlikely they both were. Mary Read died in prison of unknown causes in April 1721. Interestingly, we don't know how or when Anne Bonny died. She might have lived a few years in Jamaica before dying of unknown causes. Some purport she was rescued by her father and escaped back to Carolina, living out the remainder of her life, finally dying around the 1780s in Charleston, though this is speculative at best. Even though her career was very short-lived, she remains a legendary figure in pirate history, being one of a handful of female pirates in the Golden Age of Piracy, spawning lots of media and popular culture, and even having a statue of Bonny and Read erected in London. Pirate speak. When people think of pirates, they stereotypically think of how they spoke, saying stuff like "Arr, matey," or "Avast me hearty," or "Shiver me timbers." Pirate speak today is mostly a product of later fiction rather than history. Pirate speak was likely much more complex than this, as pirates were not a homogeneous group of people, but were comprised of a dozen or so nationalities. English, Scottish, Irish, Dutch, and French, and many more were on board a ship. Much of the modern pirate voice comes from Robert Newton, the English actor who starred Long John Silver in Disney's 1950 adaptation of Treasure Island. Newton was born in West Country, England. He used his thick accent to create a powerful, more exaggerated version of a pirate, which practically became the standard for pirate speak today. Especially "arr" and "matey" may have been used in West Country during the 1700s, but there hasn't been a recorded instance of this lingo being used by seafarers, although Newton did like using these a lot. On the other hand, some phrases are accurate, like "aye," meaning yes, "avast," meaning stop, or "bilge rat," an insult referring to unwanted rats at the bottom of the ship. It is certain pirates cussed way more often than even normal seamen, who already were pretty known for cussing a lot and drank a lot more, so they may have sounded more rough and drunk than the average working class person of the time, which is portrayed somewhat accurately in media. Importantly, these men were mostly illiterate, so they often didn't leave behind any writings or primary sources we can use to accurately pinpoint how they spoke. Some phrases are entirely made up for literary purposes, mostly by aforementioned scholar Charles Johnson. In the end, pirate speak is highly embellished and sometimes completely made up to fit a narrative, as there are little to no sources recording pirates' way of speaking, leaving a lot to the imagination of authors and directors. La Buse. Olivier Levasseur, nicknamed La Buse, the Buzzard, or La Bouche, the Mouth, was a French pirate who was mostly known for his pirate activities in the Indian Ocean. Born in 1689 or 1690 in Calais, France, to a wealthy family, he first studied to become an architect before serving as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession. At the end of the war, instead of turning in his ship, he turned to piracy and joined Benjamin Hornigold's crew in 1716. He made a good name in Hornigold's crew and proved a great leader, even though he had a scar across one eye, limiting his sight. The crew split in 1717, and Levasseur attacked several ships off the coast of Brazil before turning to a West African slave port and reducing a local fort to ruins in 1720. Due to his quick, hawk-like strikes, he earned himself the nickname La Buse, the buzzard, a name for several species of prey birds. Levasseur became shipwrecked near Mozambique and set up a new base on the island of Sainte-Marie, near Madagascar. By this time, he became completely blind on his bad eye, needing to wear an eye patch. Levasseur and a small crew of a few men captured one of the largest treasures in pirate history, the capture of the Portuguese great galleon Virgem do Cabo, I think that's right, the Virgin of the Cape, which was full of treasures belonging to the Bishop of Goa, the Patriarch of the East Indies, and the Viceroy of Portuguese India, who all were returning home to Lisbon. The capture was bloodless, as the crew surrendered without a fight. The loot consisted of bars of gold and silver, dozens of boxes full of golden guineas, a coin minted in Britain during this time, diamonds, pearls, silk, art, and religious artifacts, stolen from the Sikh Cathedral in Goa, which includes the fiery cross of Goa, made of pure gold and inlaid with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. This cross was so heavy that 3 men had to carry it on board. In fact, the men didn't even bother plundering the victim crew at all. That's how much they'd stolen. It was probably worth millions, if not tens of millions today. The crew divvied up the treasure equally, and Levasseur went into hiding, settling down on the Seychelles. 9 years after the heist, he was captured in Madagascar and hanged in Reunion for piracy on July 7, 1730. Before he was about to be executed, legend has it he threw a piece of paper onto the watching crowd and shouted in French, "Find my treasure, the one who may understand it." This paper allegedly contained a cryptogram of 17 lines. This sparked a huge treasure hunt continuing to this day, even though it likely is entirely made up, and modern historians regard the legends as 20th century fiction. In the end, La Buse goes down in the history books as one of the most legendary pirates, stealing millions worth of gems, artifacts, and gold and silver, perhaps leaving behind some of this. Henry Avery. Okay, this is a bit of a crazy entry, so bear with me. Henry Avery, sometimes erroneously called John Avery, was an English pirate born on August 20th, 1659 near Plymouth, England. He was a renowned pirate operating in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and given the name the Ark Pirate or the Pirate King by his contemporaries, so you know this guy's a big deal. Avery was a sailor from his youth, serving on Royal Navy ships in the Caribbean, North Africa, as well as fighting in the 9 Years' War for the British. After the war, in 1691, he was discharged from the Royal Navy, but joined a privateering venture known as the Spanish Expedition, aiming to raid French ships in the Caribbean with the help of the Spanish to grow the stagnating English economy. But due to complications with papers, the expedition, consisting of a couple of ships, was stuck in Spain and held there for months. Many of the sailors during this time became outraged, as they were not paid for their stay, and many became desperate, fearing they might be sold as slaves to the Spanish. This sparked a mutiny where Avery persuaded sailors from the other ships to join his cause, and then took over the ship known as Charles II with 25 other men. They then unanimously elected Avery as their captain. Avery convinced the crew to set out for the Indian Ocean and promised that every man would get a share of the treasure, while he would receive 2. They then set out for the Cape of Good Hope, also renaming the ship to the Fancy. On the journey, the crew took over ships and convinced Danish and English privateers to join their cause, numbering around 100 men, stealing ivory and gold along the way. In 1695, Avery and his crew finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and rested on the Comoros Islands, restocking on provisions and plundering a French ship along the way, convincing around 40 men to join the crew. The Fancy now numbered a strength of around 150 men. In August 1695, the crew reached the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb near Yemen and joined forces with 5 other captains, including Thomas Tew. Remember him, he will be mentioned later. Reaching a size of 6 ships and around 440 men, Avery was elected as captain to this large flotilla, and they waited for the Mughal ships to pass them. Side note, the great Mughal ships were filled to the brim with treasures and valuable goods. The Mughal Empire during this time was extremely rich, and many historians call the Mughal Empire one of a few proto-industrialized countries. This should give you an idea of how profitable raiding even just one of these ships was. A massive 25-ship large convoy was spotted near Surat, Gujarat, India. 2 escort ships were their main rivals, the 1,100-man large, 80-cannon-strong Ganj-e-Sawai and the larger 800-man large, 94-cannon-strong Fateh Mohammed. Even though Avery was massively outnumbered, the pirates attacked the two ships and engaged in hand-to-hand combat, which reportedly lasted 2 to 3 hours, but the pirates came out on top. The Ganj-e-Sawai was probably the largest of the Mughals' fleets and had cargo valued anywhere between 100,000 to 875,000 pounds, including 500,000 gold and silver pieces, though keep in mind these numbers are hotly disputed. Assuming around 600,000 pounds were stolen, this would equal around $400 million today, marking it as one of the, if not the, most valuable raid ever done by pirates, though again, this is disputed. The Mughals were naturally outraged at this loss and closed English trading ports in India, making the English put a bounty on Avery's head, and this is marked the first global manhunt in history. However, in June 1696, Avery completely disappeared from the face of the earth and the crew scattered across the globe, some moving to North American colonies and some back to the British Isles, though Avery was never seen again, being one of the few cases of a pirate actually succeeding in his endeavors and retiring in peace with his riches. The plundering of the great Mughal fleet was extremely valuable for the crew, capturing the public imagination. Avery was immediately painted as this Robin Hood-like figure, capturing from the rich and giving to the poor sailors. William Kidd. William Kidd was born in Dundee or Greenock, Scotland in 1645 and moved to New York in his early life shortly after it was taken over by the British. Here he was a seaman's apprentice on a pirate ship before beginning his well-known privateer career. In 1689 he was a part of a French-English pirate crew sailing the Caribbean under Captain Jean Fanton. Under his command, he mutinied along with other members and took over the ship. The crew then elected him as captain of the ship, named Blessed William. Kidd is mostly known for his voyage to the Indian Ocean and his apprehending of ships which raided the East India Company, as he was ordered to do so by the governor of New England. He raised funds for this endeavor and got a new ship, called the Adventure, equipped with 34 cannons, oars, and 150 men. In September 1696, Kidd set course for the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa and made his way to the Indian Ocean. By February of the next year, he arrived at the Comoros Islands off East Africa. Since he hadn't encountered any pirates yet and his crew was cut by a third due to a cholera outbreak, he became desperate to cover his costs and fulfill his contract. It is here he decided to turn to piracy and actually killed one of his own crewmen after a dispute over attacking a Dutch ship, which Kidd decided against doing. Kidd and his crew flew the French flag and encountered the Quidach merchant. In January 1698, this ship was loaded to the brim with valuable silks, satins, muslins, and gold as well as silver. When news of this capture got to England, it was considered a pirate by the government, and admirals were ordered to pursue and seize Kidd and his crew for notorious piracies they had committed. He renamed the Quidach merchant to the Adventure Prize and set sail for Madagascar. Here he encountered a pirate, Robert Culliford. Reports conflict on how or why exactly this happened, but a large part of Kidd's crew joined up with Culliford and left Kidd behind with only 13 men. Since his ship was in a pretty bad shape, he scuttled it and went on board the Adventure Prize with his loyal crew. By this time, news had reached the crew that he was a wanted man now, a man classified by the English government as a pirate and to be apprehended immediately. Fearing his treasures would fall into English hands, he sold some of this to a man named William Burke, likely scuttled the Adventure Prize, buried some of the treasures on Gardiner's Island, and left for New York. The governor of New York ordered the arrest of him, which promptly happened on July 6, 1699. Kidd was put into solitary confinement, and he and his wife were separated, never seeing each other again. Kidd was sent off to England to be put on trial, and he was found guilty on May 8, 1701, of the murder of Buse, the crew member he had killed, and 5 counts of piracy. He was promptly hanged at Execution Dock, yep, a real place, in London on May 23, 1701. His treasure on Gardiner's Island was recovered, but many people still allege he buried treasure in other places, and searches were done, for example, on Staten Island and in Nova Scotia, Canada. In the end, Kidd remains as one of these legendary figures in pirate history, seizing large treasures after turning against the government and wanting to make a name for himself. Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet, known as the Gentleman's Pirate, is closely related to Blackbeard and Benjamin Hornigold from Tier 1. He was born in 1688 near Bridgetown on the island of Barbados. His family was pretty wealthy and he inherited his father's 400-acre large property after he died, along with the 94 slaves working on his plantation. This, along with his good education, earned him a place in Barbados high society. Bonnet married a woman named Mary Allenby on the 21st of November 1701 and had 3 sons and a daughter. He held the rank of major in the Barbados militia and may have fought in the War of the Spanish Succession, but details are hazy whether he had actually fought. In any case, in spring 1717, Bonnet abandoned his family and 3 surviving children to become a pirate on the high seas. Usually, pirates were of the working class or slaves, looking for a better life, not aristocracy, which rightfully earned his name as a one-of-a-kind specimen. We don't know why exactly he decided to do this, but some theories speculate it might have been his sexuality. He might have very likely been homosexual, although an unfulfilling marriage, financial issues, mental issues, or perhaps him hearing stories of pirates abroad and wanting to become one himself was the reason for his abandonment. Importantly, he had no experiences on the sea, but still decided to contract a loyal shipyard to build him a sloop, which was equipped with 10 guns and named the Revenge, not to be confused with Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge. Bonnet recruited a crew of more than 70 men and paid them wages. Pretty unusual since pirates were paid via their share of plunder. Bonnet relied on his quartermaster and sailors for their experience, which left him not very well respected by his peers. He and his crew departed from Barbados and soon after captured and plundered 4 vessels near Chesapeake Bay off the coast of Virginia and went further north, capturing 2 more ships near New York City. In September 1717, he encountered, fought, and escaped a British warship while traveling to New Providence, which left the Revenge badly damaged, Bonnet seriously wounded, and half of the crew killed or wounded. In Nassau, he replaced his casualties and refitted the Revenge, upgrading the armament to 12 guns. Perhaps Bonnet is more known for his collaboration with Blackbeard, who he met while stationed in Nassau. They struck up an unlikely friendship, and Blackbeard took the Revenge and merged it with his flotilla, taking over command, while Bonnet was healing from his wounds. The Boston Newsletter of November 11, 1717, reported that Bonnet had been seen on Blackbeard's ship and commented, quote, "He has no command, he walks about in his morning gown," and then to his books, of which he had a good library aboard. Blackbeard and Bonnet plundered several ships off the American East Coast, including the French ship La Concorde, renamed to the Queen Anne's Revenge, as mentioned previously. Sometime after mid-December 1717, Blackbeard and Bonnet separated, but they soon encountered each other again near Belize. Here, Bonnet's crew deserted him and joined Blackbeard's crew. Bonnet had no choice but to oblige and joined Blackbeard once again. But this time, Bonnet was essentially a prisoner, confined to his quarters and having little to no say in command. Blackbeard put another man in command of the Revenge, and they sailed towards Charleston in South Carolina, famously blockading the port there. Blackbeard and Bonnet journeyed to Bath, back then the capital of North Carolina, and granted pardons under King George's Act of Grace, renouncing their piracy forever. Bonnet planned to go privateering against the Spanish, but soon found out his ships were sunk and looted by Blackbeard, his former colleague. Outraged by being betrayed, he resupplied the Revenge, renamed it to the Royal James, and himself adopting the alias Captain Thomas. He originally wanted to plot his revenge, but he missed Blackbeard on Ocracoke Island by a few hours. Bonnet returned back to his pirate ways and pillaged several more vessels. By August 1718, news had reached Charleston of a pirate vessel stationed in Cape Fear River. In late September, Colonel William Rhett led a naval expedition against Bonnet, and an hours-long battle occurred, leaving the pirates surrendering, while Bonnet escaped in custody. Bonnet was captured on November 6th, put on trial, found guilty, and hanged for piracy on December 10th. The death of Blackbeard and Bonnet marked the beginning of the end for the Golden Age of Piracy for many, and Bonnet remains in history as a special case of an aristocrat becoming a pirate. Libertalia. Libertalia, sometimes also Libertatia, was a purported legendary pirate colony founded in the late 17th century in Madagascar, allegedly founded by pirates led by Captain Misson. Our only source of this is from the second volume of A General History of the Pirates by Charles Johnson, as mentioned in Tier 1. Side note, Charles Johnson is oftentimes the only source we have on specific pirate stories, and this is partly why scholars take accounts from him with caution, as they likely are embellished or outright false. Misson was a Frenchman born in Provence. During a stay in Rome, Misson was disgusted by the Pope and his inner circle, which led him to lose his faith and rethink his principles of life. He then took over the French warship Victoire and led them aboard a journey to Madagascar. On the way there, they allegedly captured 2 ships full of African slaves and freed them. It was reportedly a place of free society, a sort of utopia, with direct democracy, where the people as a whole held authority and made laws and rules. Additionally, all people lived in harmony, no matter their ethnicity, religion, sex, etc. Its motto was "For God and Liberty," and its flag was white, a stark contrast to the black Jolly Roger. Elevated forts are said to have guarded the port of Libertalia, while living quarters were made below the forts itself. Libertalia is very likely purely a work of fiction and not a real place, probably based on actual pirate settlements on Madagascar, which there are a handful of. Libertalia never shows up anywhere else other than Charles Johnson's accounts, and is probably just an embellishment of existing colonies. Wokou. Wokou, or Wokou, translating to Japanese pirates, were pirates who raided the Chinese and Korean coastlines between the 13th and 16th centuries, first mentioned in the 4th century. This term was used after the Mongol invasions of Korea and China, as well as their attempts at conquering Japan. The people living in these areas suffered extreme poverty due to this, and thus resorted to piracy to make a living. The raids were particularly rampant throughout the later half 1300s and early 1400s, leaving many coastal villages pillaged and hundreds of pirates and soldiers dead. After the signing of the Treaty of Geihai, granting trading privileges, Wokou activities calmed down in the Korean peninsula. However, Wokou activity was not fully wiped out. In fact, it saw a resurgence in the 16th century, where the Ming dynasty enacted trade bans saying that quote-unquote unrestricted trade would lead to chaos, which reignited piratical activity in the area. The Ming dynasty also prohibited any seafaring as a whole, forcing merchants to establish themselves on offshore islands or overseas trading ports. The Ming navy was essentially non-existent and could not fight against the pirates. During this time, around 70% of Wokou sailors were Chinese, not Japanese, and many Wokou based themselves on the island of Taiwan and even entered the Philippines on the island of Luzon before they were expelled by the Spanish later on. By the end of the 17th century, the Japanese centralized and formed the Tokugawa shogunate, while the Chinese were ruled by the Qing dynasty. Most of the piracy disappeared altogether and eventually was wiped out. Roche Braziliano. Roche Braziliano, or Roque Brazilian, or some variation thereof, was a Dutch pirate. His name translates to Roque the Brazilian, but his real name was probably Gerrit Gerritson. Nothing is known of his early life, and not much information exists on him in general, other than he was born around 1630 in Groningen, the Netherlands, and moved to a settlement in Brazil at an early age, which was under Dutch rule at the time. The Portuguese captured the colony in the mid-1650s, and thus Braziliano relocated to Port Royal, Jamaica, where he joined the local buccaneers as a sailor. He was reportedly a brave man and a good sailor, popular with his peers, and elected captain after leading a mutiny. Braziliano cruised the waters around Mexico, picking off ships moving to Havana, Cuba, or Europe. Between the voyages, he would return to Port Royal to resupply, refit, and recruit new pirates, earning a reputation of a dangerous criminal. While researching this, I came across a claim that he was imprisoned in a Campeche dungeon. The governor of Campeche ordered to hang him. Braziliano got a pen and paper and forged a letter, purporting that a group of buccaneers outside of Port Royal would pillage the city if they didn't release Braziliano. Considering he and his crew were very feared and well known, the governor took that threat pretty seriously. I don't know how reliable this is, but if it did happen, he was indeed released. In any case, he purchased another ship from a man called Francois L'Olonnais. Remember this guy? He will be covered in a later entry, and continued his piracy against the Spanish. He would often get drunk and threaten to shoot anyone who did not drink with him. He was also incredibly brutal with his victims, reportedly roasting Spanish prisoners alive on wooden spits or cutting off their limbs. He would often torture and execute captured Spaniards without reason, and allegedly made Spanish prisoners eat their own comrades. The Spaniards feared him so much, in fact, that mothers would use his name as a hushword for their children. As his Jolly Roger, he used an image of a skeleton with the text, "The corpse of a Spaniard," though these claims are pretty difficult to prove. After 1671, Braziliano was never heard or seen from again. No one ever reported capturing or killing him, and he might have retired and lived the rest of his life secluded on an island, or lost at sea in a storm. Whatever became of him and his crew is lost to history. Spanish Main. I don't know why this is so low, but the Spanish Main refers to the Spanish holding that were on the mainland, bordering the Caribbean and its adjacent waters. This term is used to distinguish the smaller Spanish Caribbean islands known as the Spanish West Indies. This includes Spanish Florida, New Spain, as well as northern parts of South America. Sometimes the Spanish Main refers to a smaller part, mainly the area between Panama and Venezuela. This area was extremely wealthy, as lots of raw material was extracted from the Spanish colonies and shipped via the Spanish Main to mainland Spain in the form of gold, silver, gems, spices, hides, and much more. In hopes of profiting off of this enormous wealth, the Spanish Main became a hotspot for pirates, privateers, and buccaneers, as well as countries at war with Spain. In a lot of the pirate stories we covered this far raided these ships, though a lot of them were escorted via heavily armed galleons, protecting the riches. Thomas II, also known as the Rhode Island Pirate. Even though he's named this, we don't know whether he was actually born in Rhode Island. Evidence suggests his wealthy family was living there, but he might have been born in England around March 1649 before moving to Rhode Island. He married and had 2 daughters before moving to Bermuda in 1691. Here, the governor of Bermuda sent II a letter permitting him to attack French ships in West Africa, mainly in the Gambia. He set out along privateer Captain George Drew aboard a sloop called Amy. However, the two separated after being caught in a storm and suffered damage to their ships. II abandoned his plans here and turned to piracy, asking for the crew's support. Reportedly, they answered, quote, "A gold chain or a wooden leg will stand with you." The pirates then elected a quartermaster and elected II as their captain, who renamed the Amy to the Amity. II reached the Red Sea in late 1693, where his crew spotted a large Indian ship with over 300 soldiers sailing to the Ottoman Empire. Even though they were severely outnumbered, the pirates attacked the ship and came out victorious after a short but bloodless skirmish. II's pirates stole the ship's treasure, worth around £100,000, equivalent to around 18 million British pounds today in gold and silver alone, not even accounting for ivory, spices, and gems and silk that were taken on board. It was evenly split up between the crew. Each received around £3,000, while II received 8,000, or about £1.6 million today. He wanted to chase down the other ships in the convoy, but he yielded due to the quartermaster's reluctance. They made their way to the Cape of Good Hope and reached Rhode Island, where II settled down for around a year. In November 1694, he went out for another pirate voyage, hoping to recreate the success he had. In August 1695, he merged forces with Henry Avery and attacked the Great Mughal convoy, as mentioned in Avery's entry earlier. However, II was not as lucky as Avery. II was killed in a battle, reportedly disemboweled by a cannon shot, dying at the age of 46. Demoralized, his crew surrendered, though they were freed by Avery after the capture of the Fateh Muhammad. II's burial site is unknown, but some believe that II was one of the founders of Libertalia mentioned earlier and was buried there, though there is no evidence of him being buried in Madagascar, and his body has never been found. Samuel Bellamy. With many of these stories, we don't know much about Samuel Bellamy's early years. According to historians, he was born in 1689 in Devon, England, and joined the Royal Navy, and fought in several battles in his early teens. He might have had a wife and a child before moving to Wellfleet in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Here he met a woman named Goody Hallett, more known as Maria Hallett, even though that is not her real name, who he decided to have an affair with. In early 1716, he, with a group of men, including a friend named Palsgrave Williams, who funded the expedition, tried to find the treasures of a sunken 1715 Spanish treasure fleet, which had wrecked due to a hurricane off the coast of East Florida. Back home, legends say Hallett gave birth to a son, which unfortunately choked to death early on. Hallett was blamed for the murder and imprisoned in old jail of Barnstable, Massachusetts, which is said to be haunted to this day. Side note, I might cover an iceberg about haunted places next. Let me know if you'd like to see that in the comments below. Hallett waited for Bellamy to return. Bellamy did not, however, have good success in finding the treasure, and he, along with Williams, joined Benjamin Hornigold's crew in the Caribbean, the same crew that Blackbeard was a part of at first. In June 1716, the crew revolted after wanting to attack an English ship, which Hornigold adamantly refused to do. While Hornigold and Blackbeard split up and did their own thing, Bellamy was elected captain and Williams quartermaster respectively. The 90-man crew captured a second ship named Sultana, and Williams was elected captain of said ship. Bellamy was reportedly well-mannered, tidy, and a very tall and strong man. He liked wearing black coats and wore 4 dueling pistols in his sash. During this time, he got the nickname Black Bellamy. In spring 1717, their greatest prize was coming. Bellamy spotted the Widder galley sailing through between Hispaniola and Cuba, a state-of-the-art ship carrying ivory, indigo, and lots of silver and gold. Chasing the slave ship for 3 days, the captain surrendered after being fired at by a single shot. Since the captain surrendered without putting up a fight, Bellamy put mercy on them and traded Sultana for the Widder. Here he held a pretty famous speech where he reportedly said, quote, "I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field, and this is my conscience tells me." This massive treasure has earned him the name Robin Hood of the Sea. With enough gold and silver to retire for life, Bellamy and his crew decided to sail back to Massachusetts. Bellamy in particular wanted to revisit Hallet again. As fate has it, a storm hit the area on April 26, 1717, and the Widder was swept up and driven onto the sandbar shoals of Cape Cod, where her masts snapped, and shortly after capsized and sank beneath the waves. Bellamy and everyone but 8 men of the 146-man crew died. 6 were hanged for piracy, so only 2 men lived to tell the tale between the Bellamy and the Widder. Francois L'Olonnais. I told you to remember him earlier, and you better have. This guy was an absolute madman, in the bad way. Jean-David No, known as Francois L'Olonnais, was a French buccaneer active in the Caribbean around the 1660s. L'Olonnais was born in France and worked as a servant between 1650 and 1660, living on the island of Martinique. After his servitude was completed, he wandered various islands before arriving and settling down in Saint-Domingue in Haiti, joining the local buccaneers. He received a ship by the governor of Tortuga, who was also a buccaneer. In 1663, he was shipwrecked near Campeche, Mexico. The crew survived the initial wreckage, but a party of Spanish soldiers attacked the crew, almost killing everyone. L'Olonnais survived by covering himself with the blood of his peers and hiding beneath the bodies of the dead. L'Olonnais escaped with some surviving slaves and canoed towards Tortuga. On his way there, angered by the Spanish, he demolished a Spanish ship, but 1 Spaniard was spared. Reportedly, that Spaniard was supposed to deliver a message to the governor of Cuba, saying, quote, "I shall never henceforth give quarter to any Spaniard whatsoever." In other words, no mercy will be given to the Spanish. In 1666, L'Olonnais found a new partner, Michel de Basco, with whom he had recruited over 440 buccaneers in 8 ships. His target was the city of Maracaibo, Venezuela, a valuable target that had a very well-defended fort and was thought to be impenetrable. L'Olonnais and his crew attacked from the only weak spot at the fort, the landward side. Thus, the fort was taken in a few hours. L'Olonnais was reportedly incredibly cruel, similar to the degree that Roche Braziliano was, torturing innocent civilians, pillaging and burning much of Maracaibo, with little to no gain. Much of the civilian population unfortunately died, and many of the women were raped before being killed. All of this was just an act of vengeance. They then moved to San Antonio de Gibraltar. The crew was outnumbered, but still launched a brutal attack on the garrison, slaughtering 500 soldiers and torturing and killing much of the civilian population in the same vein as Maracaibo, for personal satisfaction, not for any particular gain. The pirates continued to ransack the city and held it for ransom. Even though the Spanish paid the ransom of around 20,000 pieces of 8, the pirates demanded more and pillaged further. The Spanish paid a total of 260,000 pieces of 8, gems, silverware, silks, and slaves to stop the crew once and for all. This has given L'Olonnais the nickname the Bane of Spain for his ferocity and cruelty. In 1667, L'Olonnais and his crew of around 700 buccaneers prepared for the next expedition. They went to the Central American mainland and pillaged a port in Honduras, where he was ambushed by a large Spanish force. He narrowly escaped and captured 2 Spaniards. He reportedly did the following to one. Quote, "He drew his cutlass, and with the cut opened the breast of one of those poor Spanish, and pulled out his heart with his sacrilegious hands, began to bite and gnaw it with his teeth, like a ravenous wolf, saying to the rest, I will serve you all alike, if you show me not another way." The remaining men retreated back to their ship, but were unable to dislodge their stuck ship. Instead, they went further inland to look for food. From here, they attacked several towns in Guatemala and Nicaragua, which didn't prove very profitable. L'Olonnais went further south toward Colombia, where he was then captured by the natives en route in the jungles of modern-day Panama. The natives reportedly, quote, "tore him in pieces alive, throwing his body limb by limb into fire and his ashes into the air, to the intent no trace, no memory might remain of such an infamous, inhuman creature." L'Olonnais remains as an incredibly brutal and downright terrifying person in human history, a pirate led by vengeance, going on a rampage against innocent civilians and natives, eating once poor Spaniard's heart, and dying in a similar brutal way himself, none of his riches he could reap the benefits of. He's easily the cruelest buccaneer in existence, and one of the most disturbing stories I've read. That was it for part 1 of the 3-part series on piracy. Part 2 will release when it's ready, but until then, like and subscribe, and leave your thoughts down below if you feel like it. But most importantly, thank you for watching. Cheers!